Davy Crockett only served 2 terms in Congress, but on one day in Congress, he was confronted with a bill to give money to the widow of a military officer. Davy Crockett arose and gave this speech. Mr. Speaker, I have as much respect for the memory of the deceased and as much sympathy for the suffering of the living, if suffering there be as any man in the house. But we must not permit our respect for the dead or our sympathy for a part of the living to lead us into an act of injustice to the balance of the living. We have the right as individuals to give away as much of our own money as we please in charity, but as members of Congress, we have no right so to appropriate a dollar of the public money. Davy Crockett continued, I'm the poorest man on this floor. I cannot vote for this bill, but I will give a 1 week's pay. I will give my check for 1 week, and if every member of Congress were to do this, it will amount to more than this bill asked for. When Crockett finished, there was silence, and remarkably, the bill failed. When later asked for an explanation, Davy Crockett explained. He said, several years ago, I was standing one evening on the steps of the Capitol when we saw a large, great light over Georgetown. It was evidently a large fire. We jumped into a hack and drove over there as fast as we could. In spite of all that could be done, many houses were burned and many families were made homeless. And besides, some of them had lost all but the clothes they had on. The weather was very cold, and when I saw so many women and children suffering, I felt that something must be done. The next morning, a bill was introduced appropriating $20,000 for their relief. We put aside all other business and rushed it through as soon as it could be done. Later in the year, when Davy Crockett was back in Tennessee, he ran into a constituent by the name of Horatio Bunce. Crockett asked him for his vote, and Horatio Bunce responded thusly. He said, "You'd better not waste your time on my vote. I shall not vote for you again. Your vote last winter shows that either you have not the capacity to understand the Constitution or that you're wanting in honesty and firmness to be guided by it. Because the Constitution, to be worth anything, must be held sacred and rigidly observed in all its provisions. The man who wields power and misinterprets the Constitution is more dangerous the more honest he is." Horatio Bunce continued. He says, "No, Colonel, there's no mistake. The newspapers say that last winter you voted for this bill to give $20,000 to some who suffered from a fire in Georgetown. Is that true?" Congressman Crockett answered him, "Well, my friend, I may as well own up. You've got me there. But certainly nobody would complain that a great and rich country like ours couldn't give $20,000, the insignificant sum of $20,000 to relieve its suffering women and children." Horatio Bunce replied to Congressman Crockett. He said, "The power of collecting and dispersing money at pleasure is the most dangerous power that can be entrusted to a man. While you are contributing to relieve one, you are drawing it from thousands who are even worse off than he. If you had the right to give anything, the amount was simply a matter of discretion with you, and you had as much right to give 20 million as to give 20,000. If you have the right to give to one, you have the right to give to all. And as the Constitution neither defines charity nor stipulates the amount, you are at liberty to give to any and everything which you may believe or profess to believe is a charity, and to any amount you may think proper. No, Colonel Crockett, Congress has no right to give charity. Individual members may give as much of their own money as they please, but they have no right to touch a dollar of the public money for that purpose. If twice as many houses had burned in this county in Tennessee as had in Georgetown, neither you nor any other members of Congress would have thought of appropriating a dollar for our relief." Bunce informed Crockett that if each congressman had shown their sympathy for the fire victims by giving 1 week's pay, it would have nearly covered the cost. But it was easier simply to give other people's money. Bunce continued, "The people about Washington no doubt applauded you for relieving them from the necessity of giving by giving what was not yours to give. The people have delegated Congress by the Constitution the power to certain things, To do these, it is authorized to collect and pay monies, and for nothing else. Everything beyond this is usurpation and a violation of the Constitution. So you see, Colonel, you have violated the Constitution in what I consider a vital point. It is a precedent fraught with danger to the country, for when Congress begins to stretch its power beyond the limits of the Constitution, there is no limit to it and no security for the people. Today we are faced with a vastly greater sum of money than $20,000. We are faced with $40 billion to be gifted to Ukraine. A noble cause, no doubt, a cause for which I have great sympathy and support, but a cause for which the Constitution does not sanction or approve of. Now we could ask, as Davy Crockett did, if each member of the Senate would like to contribute individually to Ukraine. But of course, that would simply serve to demonstrate the enormity of the gift. To come up with $40 billion, each senator would need to give $400 million. Not a likely scenario. It's much easier to spend such exorbitant amounts if you're spending someone else's money. But even if the senators won't agree to contribute their own money, surely we're a rich country and can afford it. Well, not exactly. The U.S. debt now approaches $30 trillion. In the past 2 years alone, we have added nearly $6 trillion in new debt. Inflation roars throughout the land, grocery bills are punishing the working class and poor, and gas prices exceed $5. Even before the pandemic bailouts, our country was running $1 trillion annual deficit just to pay for its routine commitments. Putting aside the constitutionality of the $40 billion to Ukraine, isn't there a more fiscally responsible way this could be done? What about taking the $40 billion from elsewhere in the budget? The U.S. spends more on our military than the next 8 countries combined. Couldn't Congress simply shift over the $40 billion and not add to the debt? In the defense of Ukraine, if the defense of Ukraine is really in our national security interest, shouldn't the gift come from our military budget? What about cutting wasteful spending? My office cataloged over $50 billion in waste. I don't know about you, but couldn't we cut programs like the $1 million study to see if taking selfies of yourself while smiling and then looking at these selfies later on, if that makes you feel good? Or couldn't we cut the budget of the National Science Foundation that spends billions of dollars studying such burning questions as, do Panamanian city frogs have a different mating call than the country frogs? Couldn't we maybe cut the $2 million the NIH spent studying cafeterias to see if someone in front of you sneezes on the food, whether you're more or less likely to eat that food? Couldn't we maybe cut the money spent on Japanese quail, studying whether or not they're more sexually promiscuous or not when you give them cocaine? Or, if we're not willing to cut the budget at all, couldn't we ask the American people to stay up and pay a war tax? If this is really for our national security, it should be very popular with the people. Why don't we offer to tax them in exchange for this? Guess what? The American people don't want to cut spending anywhere in the budget, at least their representatives don't. They don't want to pay any taxes for this. They just say, put it on my tab. But we've been doing that for decades, and that's why we have a $30 trillion debt, and that's why we have roaring inflation. If you want to pay for this with a tax, you could triple the gas tax. I'm guessing that's going to be really popular, and people really want to send this money, so badly that they'd be willing to triple the gas tax. If we were honest, that's what the people who are for this would propose. Now, that would guarantee $5 gas for the foreseeable future. Alternatively, Congress could raise the income tax about $500 for every American taxpayer. I'm sure that would be popular. And for the people who think it's a great idea to send $40 billion overseas, why don't they just be honest with people and tax them? Here's your bill, Mr. and Mrs. America, $500 a taxpayer, and then what would it be paid for? No, it's like everything else. Put it on our tab. Well, Uncle Sam's tab is full. It is complete. To be clear, I'm not for raising taxes to finance Ukraine's defense, but it's irresponsible to simply borrow more money. To borrow the money from China simply to send it to Ukraine makes no sense and makes us weaker, not stronger. But let's be honest, most of Congress doesn't seem to care about the debt, doesn't seem to care how much money we shovel out the door and out of the country. Why? Because it's not their money. Every day, Milton Friedman's statement is proven correct, that nobody spends somebody else's money as wisely as their own. I doubt the big spenders in Congress will ever consider spending any of their own money, but Americans across the land should sit up and notice and attach blame to these profligate spenders. In the past 3 months, bipartisan majorities, Republicans and Democrats, have added over $100 billion to the debt. Now, these same big spenders are proposing another $50 billion next week to bail out restaurants. Restaurants that have been primarily injured by overzealous Democrat governors and their edicts. There are ramifications to this mountain of debt. Make no mistake, inflation is here and it's rip-roaring and on the rise. Just as aiding the victims of fire in Georgetown during the days of Davy Crockett ignored the misfortune of the suffering people in lands too distant from Washington to be noticed, so too does today's deficit spending to be sent overseas ignores the pain and suffering and the inflation that is caused by that debt on everyday American families. Inflation is simply an increase in the money supply. It comes from the Federal Reserve buying the U.S. debt. M2 is a measure of the money supply. For the last 3 years, it's been going up at about a 15% rate. So we shouldn't really be surprised that there's inflation because inflation is an increase in the money supply. In January of last year, the annualized rate of the M2 expansion, the monetary expansion, was 27%. No one should be shocked. We have inflation. We have rising prices in the grocery store. We have rising prices at the pump because we borrowed too much money. We went heavily in debt and the Federal Reserve is buying the debt. All of this so-called free money floods the market and chases prices higher. Adding to our debt will only make the problem worse. So yes, our national security is threatened, not by Russia's war on Ukraine, but by Congress's war on the American taxpayer. The vast majority of Americans sympathize with Ukraine and want them to repel the Russian invaders. But if Congress were honest, they'd take the money from elsewhere in the budget, or ask Americans to pay higher taxes, or heaven forbid, loan the money to Ukraine instead of giving it to Ukraine. But Congress will do what Congress does best, spend other people's money. I, for one, will not. I will vote no. Somehow, somewhere, a voice of fiscal sanity must remain vigilant, must remain stalwart and steady in a sea of fiscal madness.